Before we get too far in this course, it's important to think about where oceanography comes from. So later in the course, we'll talk about the ocean as an environment for life, waves and tides, currents, things like that. But truth be told, we wouldn't understand a lot of that if it weren't for the research and the people that have been looking into this. And so we're going to talk about some of the steps that oceanography has taken through time. So some of the earliest times that we've seen in oceanography date back to the Paleolithic and Neolithic periods, where local people were gathering food in tide pool areas, and they began exploring and trying to understand why certain organisms were located there. Much later, the Egyptians began doing some more searching and learning when they started fishing. And this started inshore, but then became offshore fishing. And they began looking for new places to find fish and exploring, which ultimately led to the need for better boats. And so the natural progression that ensued from there allowed for people to harvest the sea better. And so, in essence, understanding how the sea works let people understand how fish worked, and in essence drove the culture and the need to harvest those resources. The Phoenicians were experts at trade and exploration and were some of the first to have a navy. In terms of fishing, the background of fishing goes way back. There, in every culture, you can see a lot of instances and examples of the early types and resources used for fishing. Any museum that's coastal probably has a fishing component that talks about how fish were collected or gathered, when and where. And so a lot of the artifacts that exist from these old times can tell you a lot about what was going on. So here we've got a bunch of different fish hooks from various cultures. Here's an Alaska native halibut hook that was developed first as a way to catch halibut, but then artistically that could tell historians a little bit about the time and people that collected this resource. Now we add boats. And so boats allow fishermen access to the sea in places they couldn't get from the coast. So now that we're not talking about shallow water fish traps and fishing from shore, fishing off cliffs and stuff like that, we're getting out into the environment. And so the iteration of, or the evolution of boat building and boats' ability to get out to those resources evolved rather quickly and in various ways throughout the world. So as we continue with the early times, we leave the Phoenicians and we come to the Polynesians that were some of the greatest navigators of our time. They used the environment as well as the stars to figure out where they were. And they were able to kind of colonize a huge chunk of the ocean. I'll show you a diagram of where they went. But really, we're talking about an island nation of people that just went out exploring, looking for new ways to live in their particular environment. In the Middle Eastern, exploration of the Indian Ocean and other areas led to trade routes between India and China, which allowed for resources to be traded between nations, and really opened up resources to the riches of other regions. And then the Greeks, well known for their philosophy, also dabbled in science and geography, and were some of the first to create a global atlas. So I mentioned the Polynesians before. Polynesia, poly means many, and nesia, I think, means islands. And so the Polynesians were well known for developing ways to travel between islands. And so in this diagram you can see some of the many areas that have been explored by the Polynesian people. And to this day the culture is spread out on many islands throughout the kind of western Pacific. And even pop culture is kind of signed on for this. I don't know if any of you have young kids, but my kids are big time into Moana. And a lot of the art, a lot of the culture, a lot of the idea of, kind of being voyagers, going out into the sea and looking for new lands and new resources was kind of important to the way of the Polynesian people. In terms of navigation, the Polynesian had developed many ways to make these long voyages across the Pacific. They often travel to uninhabited islands using what they call wayfinding. And again, this is brought up in Moana. I could sing a song, but I'm assuming that you'll prefer that I not. But in essence, it was about knowing where you are and what conditions look like, so that you know where you've been. That may not be a direct quote from the movie, but I think it's pretty close. But the idea is people understood how to kind of map out where they were. And you could see, here's some rough kind of rudimentary maps, if you will, ways that people could map out trade routes between islands, in addition to using the stars for navigation. So that's it for the early times. In the next segment, we'll talk about some more advances in the understanding oceanography.